When Sarah first married Tom, she believed in the promises they had made to each other. She remembered the warmth in his eyes, the firm grip of his hands as they held hers at the altar. His words sounded so certain, so real, that she had no reason to doubt them. For years, she convinced herself that the little cracks in their relationship were temporary. But as the honeymoon glow faded, Sarah quickly learned that the man she had married was not the one standing before her. His temper was sharp, and his patience paper thin. It started with harsh words, criticisms about her cooking, her appearance, her choices. He would belittle her in front of friends, masking his cruelty in a humor that everyone else found charming. Yet, when they were alone, that charm slipped away. Tom was not always violent. In fact, Sarah could count the times he had hit her, only 3 times, but the memory of each slap lingered long after the bruises faded. His cruelty wasn't just in his hands, it was in his silence, his sneers, and the way he twisted every argument into her fault. On good days, Sarah convinced herself that he loved her. She thought that maybe, if she could be better, nicer, prettier, quieter, he would stop. She tried everything, molding herself into a version that might please him. But nothing worked. The first time he hit her, she was stunned. It wasn't hard, more like a warning slap to the face after she had forgotten to pick up his dry cleaning. He apologized profusely after, blaming his stress from work, his frustrations, and Sarah forgave him, because that's what wives did, right? But it didn't stop there. The next slap came months later, harder this time. There was no apology afterward, only a cold stare and a reminder that he had been patient with her failings. Her friends noticed her withdrawal, but Sarah was good at wearing a mask. She made excuses for Tom, just as she made excuses for the bruises that started to appear. They were small at first, a bump against the kitchen counter, a fall down the stairs, but she never said a word about the real cause. Her mother-in-law, Alice, was one of those women who believed a husband could do no wrong. Whenever Sarah hinted at her struggles, Alice would brush it off with stories of how marriages had ups and downs. Tom's just stressed, she'd say. Give him time. But time wasn't something Sarah had much left of. Sarah learned quickly to live in silence. The walls of her home, once imagined as a sanctuary, became a prison. There was no more laughter, no more warmth. Every step she took inside that house was measured, each word carefully chosen to avoid Tom's fury. He was like a ticking bomb, and she, his prisoner, never knowing when he would explode. Tom had his good days, of course. On those days, he would come home, pull her into a half-hearted hug, and ask about her day. For a brief moment, Sarah would allow herself to believe that things might change, that the man she had married was still in there somewhere. But those moments were fleeting. The slightest inconvenience, a burnt dinner, a forgotten errand, could send him spiraling into a fit of rage. The bruises on her body were easy to hide, but the wounds on her heart were deeper than anyone could see. She used makeup to cover the purple marks on her arms, long sleeves to hide the imprints of his fingers around her wrist. And whenever anyone asked why she seemed distant, she would smile and say, "I've just been busy." Her neighbors probably heard the shouting. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, when Tom had drunk too much or when his anger had no other outlet, the walls of their house would tremble with his voice. But no one came. No one knocked on the door to check on her. No one asked if she was okay. It was as though everyone had chosen to ignore the signs, to let her suffer in silence. Sarah had thought about leaving. She had packed a suitcase once, in the middle of one of Tom's more terrifying outbursts. She had made it to the front door, her hands trembling on the knob. But Tom had caught her. He didn't yell that time. He didn't even raise his hand. He just smiled, a cold, knowing smile, and whispered in her ear, "Where do you think you're going? You'll never leave me. No one will believe you." And he was right. Who would believe her? To the outside world, Tom was charming, successful, and well-liked. He had a way of making people believe in the perfect life they led. Sarah wasn't sure anyone would believe her story, and the thought of going through the shame of telling it kept her rooted in place. The days stretched into weeks, the weeks into months, and with each passing moment, Sarah grew more and more certain that this was her life. She would never escape him, never know the freedom of a life without fear. The weight of her existence pressed down on her, suffocating her with every breath she took. But then, one night, everything changed. Tom had come home late, reeking of alcohol and perfume. Sarah knew that smell. It wasn't hers. It was the scent of another woman, a reminder of how little Tom valued their marriage. She had suspected for months that he was having an affair, but now, with the evidence clinging to his skin, she knew for certain. He didn't even bother to hide it. He staggered into the house, mumbling something incoherent about a late night at the office. But Sarah didn't care anymore. The rage she had been bottling up for so long was threatening to explode. That night, for the first time in years, she fought back. It wasn't a physical fight. Sarah knew better than that. Tom was stronger, and she didn't stand a chance in a physical confrontation. But the war waged in her mind, in her heart, as she stood there watching him stumble to bed. She could hear his snores from the living room, the steady rhythm of his breathing like a metronome counting down to her breaking point. And that's when the plan started to form. A dark, dangerous plan. One that would end this nightmare once and for all. Sarah knew she couldn't leave him, not in the traditional sense. He would never let her go, not without a fight. And even if she tried, he would find her, bring her back, and the punishment for leaving would be worse than anything she had endured before. No, the only way out was through him. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining the life she could have without Tom. A life where she wasn't constantly looking over her shoulder, where her heart didn't race every time he walked through the door. And slowly, a calm settled over her. It was a peace she hadn't felt in years. By morning, she had made her decision. She wouldn't run. She wouldn't hide. She would make sure Tom could never hurt her again. The plan wasn't perfect, but it was the only one she had. Sarah started small, researching ways to poison someone without drawing attention. It had to be subtle, something that would take time, something that wouldn't raise suspicion. She knew it would be dangerous, that she could get caught. But at this point, she didn't care. Her life was already a prison, and death, either his or her own, seemed like the only way out. The next day, Sarah went about her routine as usual. She cooked breakfast, cleaned the house, smiled at Tom when he left for work. But inside, a storm was brewing, and for the first time in years, she felt in control. The discovery of Tom's affair was the moment everything snapped for Sarah. She had lived through years of abuse, convincing herself she could endure it. But this betrayal was the final straw. It wasn't the violence that finally broke her. It was the infidelity. The moment she smelled the perfume on his shirt, something deep inside her shifted. She wasn't shocked. She had suspected it for months. The late nights at work, the long business trips that left her alone in their hollow house. He had grown distant, colder, if that were even possible. She remembered the way he brushed off her questions, offering vague explanations that never quite added up. And yet, she had clung to the idea that maybe, just maybe, there was still something left between them. That night, as Tom lay passed out in their bed, the stench of alcohol and another woman's scent on him, Sarah knew the truth. He wasn't just cruel. He was a liar, a cheater. The life she had spent years enduring was built on nothing but deceit. She felt no sadness, no devastation, only a cold, hard rage that settled in her chest like a stone. In the quiet of the night, Sarah sat at the edge of their bed, watching Tom sleep. She stared at his face, trying to remember the man she had married. He was unrecognizable now. His features, once so familiar, seemed foreign to her. How had she ever loved this man? How had she let herself become trapped in this nightmare? Her mind raced with the possibilities. She could leave. She could pack her bags and walk out the door, disappear into the night, and never look back. But she knew better. Tom would find her. He had the resources, the connections, and even if she managed to escape, he would make her life a living hell from a distance. No, running wasn't an option. She needed a more permanent solution. The next morning, as Tom prepared for work, Sarah moved through the motions of their routine with precision. She made his coffee just the way he liked it, black, no sugar. She cooked his breakfast, laying out the eggs and bacon on the table without a word. Tom barely glanced at her, too absorbed in his phone. He was probably texting her, Sarah thought, her stomach turning at the idea of it. "Busy day at work?" she asked, her voice steady, masking the fury boiling inside her. "Yeah," Tom muttered, not looking up. "Lots to do." Sarah smiled, though the gesture didn't reach her eyes. "Well, Don't work too hard. He didn't notice the edge in her voice, didn't see the way her hands clenched into fists behind her back. He never noticed anymore. To him, she was invisible, nothing more than an object in the house, a piece of furniture to be moved and controlled at will. But that was about to change. When he left the house, she waited until she heard the car pull away before she began her research. Her heart raced as she sat at the computer, fingers hovering over the keyboard. She felt a strange mixture of fear and excitement. Fear of being caught, excitement at the prospect of finally being free. She typed the words into the search bar, her breath shallow. How to poison someone without getting caught. The results flooded the screen, a sea of information she hadn't expected. Articles, forums, discussions. There was a dark underworld of people who had thought the same thoughts, who had been pushed to the same brink. She wasn't alone in her desperation, but that didn't bring her comfort. It only made the reality of what she was planning more tangible. The key, she learned, was patience. A quick, obvious poisoning would draw attention, but a slow, gradual method, a poison that mimicked natural illness, was much harder to detect. Sarah scrolled through the options, her eyes lingering on the one that seemed most promising: arsenic. It was a classic, but for good reason. Administered in small doses over time, it would cause symptoms that could easily be mistaken for a variety of illnesses: fatigue, nausea, muscle weakness. By the time the victim died, the poison would have done its work so subtly that no one would suspect foul play. It was perfect. The next step was obtaining it. Sarah knew she had to be careful. She couldn't simply buy arsenic from a local store. That would raise too many red flags. But she discovered that small amounts of arsenic could be found in certain pest control products, ones that were still legal in certain rural areas. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She made her trip out of town, driving several hours to a place where no one would recognize her. She purchased the product in cash, her heart pounding the entire time. When she got back to the house, she tucked it away in the back of the pantry, behind the old boxes of flour and sugar that Tom never touched. The first time she used it, she was trembling. She had mixed a tiny amount of the arsenic into his coffee, just a few granules. It was hardly enough to do any real damage, but it was a start. Tom drank it without a second thought, as he always did, too busy on his phone to notice the way Sarah's hands shook as she placed the mug in front of him. Days passed, and Sarah continued to administer the poison in small, barely detectable doses. Each time, her nerves settled a little more, the fear replaced by a cold, calculated determination. Tom began to complain of headaches, fatigue, and stomach pains. At first, he dismissed it as stress, but as the days went on, the symptoms worsened. Sarah watched him closely, her expression neutral as he groaned and grimaced in pain. She played the role of the concerned wife perfectly, offering him medicine, suggesting he see a doctor. But Tom, in his arrogance, refused. He was a strong man, he insisted. He didn't need a doctor. He just needed to rest. And so, Sarah waited. Each day, she added a little more to his coffee, his meals. She was careful not to rush it, not to make it too obvious. The poison worked slowly, eating away at him, while Sarah's mask of innocence remained firmly in place. As the days wore on, Tom's condition continued to deteriorate. His once robust physique began to wither, the dark circles under his eyes growing more pronounced with each passing day. His complaints became more frequent, the headaches unbearable, the stomach pains leaving him doubled over in agony. Sarah played the part of the doting wife effortlessly, always there with a glass of water, a gentle touch, a suggestion to rest. But inside, she was watching with cold calculation, tracking each symptom like a tally on a scorecard. Tom's arrogance prevented him from seeking medical attention. He was convinced that whatever was happening to him was temporary. A virus, maybe? A bad reaction to something he ate. Every time Sarah offered to call the doctor, he waved her off with a grumble. "I don't need a damn doctor. It's just stress," he muttered, clutching his stomach. She could feel it. Her plan was working. The poison was doing its job, slowly but surely, taking him apart piece by piece. And yet, as the days turned into weeks, Sarah found herself caught in an emotional whirlwind. She had thought that watching Tom suffer would bring her some sense of satisfaction, some relief from the years of torment he had put her through. But instead, she felt nothing. The numbness was unexpected. She had imagined that killing Tom would feel empowering, that she would finally be free from the chains of his abuse. But instead, it was as if she were watching everything happen from a distance, detached and cold. Maybe it was the years of conditioning, of living in survival mode, that had hardened her heart. Or maybe she had simply run out of feelings for him altogether. One morning, as Sarah poured Tom's coffee and mixed in the poison with a practiced hand, she caught a glimpse of herself in the kitchen window. The woman staring back at her was unrecognizable. She was no longer the hopeful young bride who had once believed in love and happy endings. She was something else now, something darker, colder. She wondered when exactly the transformation had taken place. Was it after the first slap? Or had it been a slow erosion over the years? A piece of her soul chipped away with every insult, every bruise? She took a deep breath, steadying herself. There was no room for doubt now. She was too far in. This was the only way to end the nightmare that had become her life. Tom's condition had worsened to the point where he could no longer hide it. He had taken to lying on the couch all day, moaning in pain, his skin pale and clammy. Sarah went through the motions, offering him sympathy, pretending to care. She brought him soup, fluffed his pillows, and smiled at his mother, Alice, when she called to check in. "How's my boy doing?" Alice's voice crackled through the phone one afternoon. Sarah had always found her mother-in-law's concern for Tom infuriating. In Alice's eyes, Tom could do no wrong. He was her perfect son, and any problems in their marriage were undoubtedly Sarah's fault. "He's not well, Alice," Sarah said, keeping her voice soft and measured. "He's been very sick lately." "Sick? What do you mean sick? Why hasn't he gone to the doctor?" "You know how Tom is," Sarah said with a sigh. "He doesn't think it's serious, but I'm worried. I really think he should see someone." Alice tutted on the other end of the line. "Men," she muttered, "always too stubborn for their own good. I'll talk to him. Maybe I can convince him to go." Sarah nodded, though she knew it wouldn't matter. Tom was too far gone now. Even if he did see a doctor, the poison had already done enough damage that it wouldn't be long before his body gave out completely. The conversation with Alice was a reminder of the delicate balance Sarah had to maintain. She couldn't afford to raise suspicion. Every interaction had to be carefully managed, every word calculated. She needed Alice to believe that she was the loving wife, the one who had stood by Tom's side through his illness. It was all part of the plan. That evening, as she helped Tom into bed, his breathing shallow and labored, she felt a strange sense of calm. The end was near. She could see it in his eyes. The fear, the confusion. He didn't understand what was happening to him, and that was exactly how she wanted it. A week later, it happened. It was early in the morning when Sarah found him. Tom had never made it out of bed. His body was cold, his skin a sickly gray. She stood there for a moment, staring down at him, waiting for the emotions to come. Anger? Relief? Guilt? But there was nothing. Just the quiet hum of the house, the ticking of the clock on the wall. With a practiced detachment, she picked up the phone and called 911. "My husband." Her voice wavered, just enough to sound believable. "He's not breathing. I think he's dead." The paramedics arrived within minutes, but Sarah knew it was already too late. They tried to revive him, going through the motions of chest compressions and oxygen masks, but it was all pointless. Tom was gone. The next few days passed in a blur. There were police, of course. They had to ask questions. It was routine. But Sarah played the grieving widow perfectly. She cried when she was supposed to, her face pale and drawn. She wore black at the funeral, her head bowed, her hand clutched in Alice's. The old woman sobbed into Sarah's shoulder, mourning the loss of her son, while Sarah whispered soothing words of comfort. In the end, no one suspected a thing. Tom's death was ruled a heart attack, brought on by stress and illness. The police closed the case without further investigation, and Sarah was free to start over, free to live the life she had always dreamed of, without Tom's shadow looming over her. In the days following Tom's death, Sarah found herself living in a strange, surreal haze. Everything seemed muted, as though the world had dimmed its lights just for her. The neighbors came by with casseroles and flowers, offering condolences and solemn faces, their voices hushed as they spoke to her. Sarah responded with the same rehearsed lines, "Thank you. It's been hard, and I just can't believe he's gone." She would press her lips into a tight smile, then quickly let her face fall into a mask of grief. Inside, she felt nothing. No relief, no satisfaction. She had expected to feel some kind of release now that Tom was gone, but all she felt was an emptiness that gnawed at her, an unfamiliar silence where fear and anxiety used to live. It wasn't that she missed him. God, no. But the space he left behind was unsettling, like she had been holding her breath for so long that she had forgotten what it was like to exhale. She had learned early on in her marriage to put on the perfect mask. She had worn it for years, and now it was second nature. Her performance of grief was flawless. When the coroner called to confirm the cause of death, a heart attack, she let out a choked sob, thanked him for his help, and hung up the phone. The funeral had been a small affair, attended by family, a few friends, and Tom's colleagues from work. His mother, Alice, had been inconsolable, collapsing into Sarah's arms as the coffin was lowered into the ground. Sarah held her, murmuring words of comfort, stroking her back as Alice wept for her beloved son. "I don't know how I'll live without him," Alice had whispered through her tears. Sarah had nodded, her throat tightening. She could think of no words to say. In truth, she hadn't even begun to process what life without Tom would truly be like. It was still too soon. Everything felt like a blur. The days turned into weeks, and life moved on. The casseroles stopped coming. The phone calls grew less frequent. Eventually, people stopped asking how she was holding up. The world had moved on from Tom, and now it was Sarah's turn to figure out what came next. She was careful in everything she did. She knew the police had closed the case, but that didn't mean she could let her guard down. People like Alice would always be watching, always whispering. If she made one wrong move, one slip-up, it could all unravel. So she played her part to perfection. She kept up appearances, visited Alice every week, cooked her favorite meals, and listened patiently as the older woman reminisced about Tom's childhood. Sarah didn't mind. The guilt weighed on her sometimes when she saw how devastated Alice was. But then she would remember the bruises, the nights spent in fear, and the guilt would dissipate, replaced by a cold resolve. One afternoon, a few weeks after the funeral, a knock came at the door. Sarah answered it to find Detective Martin standing on her porch. He had been the lead investigator on Tom's case, though there hadn't been much of a case to investigate. "Mrs. Anderson," he said, his tone formal but not unfriendly. "I hope I'm not intruding." "No, not at all," Sarah replied, stepping aside to let him in. Her heart began to race, but outwardly she remained calm. Martin took off his hat, nodding politely as he entered. "I just wanted to stop by and check in. I know it's been a difficult time for you, and I wanted to make sure you're doing all right." Sarah smiled weakly. "That's very kind of you. I'm managing, I suppose. It's still hard to believe he's really gone." Martin nodded, his eyes scanning the room as though taking in every detail. "I'm sure it is. Losing someone is never easy, especially under such sudden circumstances." She felt his gaze linger on her for a moment longer than necessary, and a small chill ran down her spine. Was he suspicious, or was this just standard procedure? Sarah reminded herself to stay calm. The police had already ruled it a heart attack. There was nothing to fear. "Have you been able to settle things with Tom's estate?" Martin asked, his voice casual, but the question struck her as odd. "We're still working through it," Sarah said carefully. "There are a lot of papers to sort out, but I've been taking it slow. I haven't been ready to deal with all of it yet." "That's understandable," Martin replied. "If you need any help navigating it, there are plenty of resources available." "Thank you," Sarah said, feeling a growing unease. "I'll keep that in mind." There was a pause, and Martin cleared his throat. "You know, Tom was a young man. It's always a bit surprising when someone his age passes so suddenly. It got me thinking." Here it was, the question she had been dreading. Did Tom ever mention feeling unwell before his death? Any strange symptoms? Sarah hesitated for only a split second before shaking her head. He mentioned being tired. He was under a lot of stress at work, and he had been complaining about headaches and stomach pains, but we both thought it was just stress. He refused to go to the doctor. You know how stubborn he was. Martin nodded, still watching her closely. "It's a shame. If he had seen a doctor, maybe things could have been different." "Maybe," Sarah murmured. Her palms were starting to sweat, but she kept her composure. The detective lingered a little longer, asking a few more polite questions about how she was adjusting to life without Tom before finally excusing himself. When he left, Sarah closed the door, not leaning against it, with a heavy sigh. That had been too close. She had answered all his questions perfectly, but the fact that he had come by at all left her on edge. Was he suspicious? Or was it just her paranoia getting the best of her? Over the next few weeks, Sarah found herself thinking more and more about her future. Now that Tom was gone, she had decisions to make. She could no longer live in the house they had shared. Too many memories, too many ghosts. The neighbors were kind enough, but she could feel their pitying eyes on her every time she stepped outside. It was suffocating. One evening, as she sat at the kitchen table, the decision became clear. She would sell the house. It was the final step in moving on, in shedding the last remnants of her old life. With the money from the sale, she could start fresh somewhere new. A new city, a new identity. No one would know her as Tom Anderson's widow. She would just be Sarah, free and untethered. She contacted a realtor the next morning, and within weeks, the house was on the market. It sold quickly, too quickly, almost. It was as if the universe was clearing the way for her escape, laying out a path for her to follow. The night before she left, Sarah stood in the empty house, looking around at the bare walls and vacant rooms. It didn't feel like her home anymore. It hadn't felt like home in years. She thought of Tom, of everything she had done to escape him, and for a brief moment, she wondered if he was watching her, somehow aware of what she had done. But the thought passed quickly. She didn't believe in ghosts. With one last glance, she closed the door behind her and walked away from the life she had once known. The car ride to her new life was quiet, almost too quiet. Sarah hadn't realized how accustomed she had grown to the noise of her old life, the constant hum of Tom's presence, the tension always crackling in the air. Now, as she drove down the empty highway toward a city where no one knew her, she felt the vastness of the silence. It was eerie, yet liberating. Her new city was far enough from her past to make her feel safe, yet not so distant that she couldn't return if needed. The moment she crossed the city limits, she felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she had left her old self behind on the road. The apartment she had rented was small but comfortable, and more importantly, it was hers. No memories of Tom lingered here. No shadows from their past life haunted these walls. The first few weeks passed without much thought. Sarah set about building a new routine, unpacking boxes, decorating her new space, finding a job at a local bookstore. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was exactly what she needed. Something simple, mindless, a way to keep herself busy without getting too close to anyone. Her coworkers were friendly enough. They asked polite questions about her background, but Sarah had her story ready. She was a widow, her husband had died suddenly, and she had needed a fresh start. People seemed to accept that without question, offering her sympathy and kind words. They didn't pry, and for that, Sarah was grateful. For a while, things seemed almost normal. But as the weeks passed, something began to shift. The calm she had felt after leaving her old life behind began to unravel, replaced by a creeping sense of unease. It started with small things. A knock on the door late at night, though no one was there when she answered. A flash of movement out of the corner of her eye that disappeared when she turned to look. The unsettling feeling that she was being watched, even though she was alone. She told herself it was nothing, just the residual anxiety from the months of planning, the guilt gnawing at her subconscious. She had gotten away with it. Tom was dead, and no one suspected a thing. So why did she feel like someone was watching her? Why did she keep looking over her shoulder, expecting to see something or someone lurking in the shadows? Then came the dreams. At first, they were fragmented, blurry images that she could barely recall upon waking. But as the nights went on, they grew more vivid. Tom was in them, of course. Always Tom. In the dreams, he wasn't the sick, weakened man she had watched die. He was strong again, towering over her, his hands wrapped around her throat. His voice echoed in her ears, accusing, demanding. "You killed me," he would whisper. "You thought you could get away, but you can't." Sarah would wake in a cold sweat, her heart pounding, the taste of fear thick in her throat. She would lie in bed for hours afterward, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sun to rise so the darkness would fade. During the day, she tried to distract herself, to shake off the unease that clung to her like a shadow. She threw herself into work, spending extra hours at the bookstore, but the quiet moments in between customers gave her too much time to think, too much time to remember. Her coworkers noticed the change in her. One afternoon, as Sarah was organizing a shelf of books, her manager Clara approached her, concern etched on her face. "You okay, Sarah?" she asked, leaning against the counter. "You've seemed a little off lately." Sarah forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine. Just adjusting, I guess." Clara studied her for a moment, as if trying to read between the lines of Sarah's words. "If you ever need to talk about anything, I'm here." Sarah nodded, grateful for the offer, but knowing she would never take her up on it. Talking about it meant opening up, and opening up meant risking everything. No one could know what she had done. Not ever. That evening, as Sarah made her way home, the streets felt darker than usual. It was early autumn, and the days were growing shorter, the nights colder. She pulled her jacket tighter around her as she walked, her footsteps echoing in the empty streets. She wasn't far from her apartment when she felt it again, the sensation of being watched. She stopped, turning slowly to scan her surroundings. The street was empty, save for the occasional flicker of headlights in the distance. But the feeling persisted, a cold, unsettling presence lingering just out of sight. She quickened her pace, her heart racing, telling herself it was nothing, just her imagination. But as she rounded the corner to her building, she saw it. A figure, standing in the shadows near the entrance to her apartment. They were too far away for her to make out any details, but the sight of them sent a jolt of fear through her body. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. Who were they? What did they want? For a moment, she considered turning around, walking the other way, but something kept her rooted to the spot. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching. With a trembling hand, Sarah reached into her pocket, fumbling for her phone. She couldn't think straight, her mind clouded with fear and panic. But just as she was about to dial, the figure stepped back into the shadows, disappearing from sight. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood there, her mind racing. Had it been real? Or was she starting to lose her grip on reality? When she finally made it inside her apartment, she locked the door behind her and leaned against it, her body shaking. She didn't sleep that night. Every creak, every rustle of wind outside her window sent her mind spiraling. In the days that followed, Sarah became consumed by paranoia. Every stranger on the street felt like a threat. Every glance in her direction filled her with suspicion. She began avoiding people, keeping to herself, retreating further into her isolation. The figure in the shadows haunted her thoughts, and though she never saw them again, the fear lingered. Her dreams grew worse. Tom's voice, once a whisper, now screamed in her ears, accusing her, blaming her for his death. "You can't escape," he would say, his voice twisted with malice. "I'll always be with you." One night as she lay awake in the darkness, her mind racing, she realized something terrifying. Tom wasn't gone. Not really. His death hadn't freed her. It had trapped her in a new kind of prison, a prison of her own making. Sarah's paranoia grew like a vine, wrapping itself around her thoughts, suffocating any sense of calm she had once felt. It wasn't just the nightmares anymore. It was the gnawing sensation that followed her in every waking moment, the constant fear that her carefully constructed life was on the verge of unraveling. She stopped sleeping. Every night, the moment she closed her eyes, Tom was there. His presence was suffocating, his face twisted with anger, his accusations ringing in her ears. "You killed me," he would hiss over and over until she would wake, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. Her days weren't much better. At work, she would catch herself staring at the customers too long, wondering if they knew, if somehow they could see through her mask of normalcy. Clara had noticed too, pulling Sarah aside one afternoon, her voice laced with concern. "You've been really off lately," Clara said gently. "I'm worried about you." "I'm fine," Sarah replied too quickly, forcing a smile, but even she could hear how hollow the words sounded. "You're not fine, Sarah. You've barely been here mentally. If you need time off, I can cover your shifts for a while." Sarah shook her head. "No, really, I'm fine. I just haven't been sleeping well." Clara didn't look convinced, but she let it go, giving Sarah a soft, sympathetic smile before walking away. The truth was, Sarah didn't want time off. Time off meant more time alone with her thoughts. And right now, her thoughts were a dangerous place to be. The strange occurrences around her apartment didn't stop. Some nights, she could swear she heard someone moving outside her door, faint footsteps in the hallway. Other nights, she was certain she saw shadows shifting outside her window, though when she looked, there was never anyone there. She told herself it was her mind playing tricks on her, a side effect of the lack of sleep, but the fear that gnawed at her was too real to ignore. The figure she had seen that one night lingered in her thoughts. Who had it been? Was it her imagination? Or had someone been watching her? As the days passed, she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. That even though Tom was dead, the past wasn't done with her. And then, there were the phone calls. They started late at night, just as Sarah was about to drift off into another restless sleep. The phone would ring once, then stop. At first, she thought it was a wrong number, but after the third time, it felt intentional. Whoever was calling never left a message, never said a word. Just the eerie silence on the other end of the line, a silence that seemed to echo her own inner turmoil. She began to dread the nights, knowing the phone would ring again, always at the same time. It was as if someone was toying with her, testing her. She thought about changing her number, but deep down, she feared that wouldn't stop whoever it was from finding her. One evening, Sarah sat in the living room, staring at the phone on the table. It was almost midnight, the hour when the calls usually came. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the phone, her thumb hovering over the screen, debating whether to turn it off. But she didn't. A part of her needed to know, needed to hear it. And right on cue, the phone rang. Sarah's heart leapt into her throat, her pulse racing. She stared at the number on the screen. It was unknown, as always. Her hand shook as she answered, bringing the phone to her ear. "Hello?" Her voice was barely a whisper, her throat tight. There was nothing. No breathing, no sound, just silence. Sarah's grip on the phone tightened, her mind racing. Was it him? Was it someone who knew? Panic flared in her chest as the seconds stretched on. Finally, a voice, soft, almost a whisper, broke the silence. "You can't hide." Sarah's breath hitched. Her body went cold. The voice was unmistakable, even though she hadn't heard it in weeks. It was Tom. She dropped the phone, her hands shaking uncontrollably as it clattered to the floor. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. How? How was this happening? Tom was dead. She had made sure of it. She scrambled to pick up the phone, staring at the screen. The call had ended, the number gone, as if it had never happened. Her heart pounded in her chest as she sat there, trying to make sense of it all. It wasn't possible. Tom was gone. He couldn't be calling her. But the voice had been so real, so clear, and those words, "You can't hide." Sarah spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch, her arms wrapped around herself, her mind spiraling. She was unraveling. She knew it. The guilt, the fear, it was all catching up to her. She had thought she could escape, but now it felt like the walls were closing in, suffocating her. The next day, she called Alice, her voice shaking as she asked if she could come over. Alice had been a lifeline of sorts in the weeks following Tom's death, someone who believed in her grief, who saw her as nothing more than the widow of her beloved son. Sarah knew it was risky, keeping up the charade with Alice, but she needed the connection, needed to be near someone who didn't suspect the truth. When she arrived at Alice's house, the older woman greeted her with open arms, pulling her into a tight embrace. "Oh, Sarah, I've missed you," Alice said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's been so hard without him." Sarah nodded, trying to keep the tears at bay. She had come here to escape her own head, but being in Alice's home, surrounded by photos of Tom, only intensified the guilt gnawing at her insides. They sat down in the living room, the weight of Tom's absence hanging in the air like a cloud. Alice talked about him, reminiscing about his childhood, his career, how proud she had always been of him. Sarah listened quietly, nodding at the appropriate moments, but her mind was elsewhere. She could still hear his voice. "You can't hide." "I don't know how you've been so strong, Sarah," Alice said suddenly, snapping Sarah out of her thoughts. "I don't know how you've managed to hold it together." Sarah bit her lip, unsure of how to respond. If only Alice knew the truth, the darkness Sarah had been carrying with her every day. Alice leaned forward, her eyes soft and full of sympathy. "You know, "Sometimes I feel like Tom's still here," she said quietly. "Like I can hear his voice, feel his presence." Sarah's blood ran cold. The room seemed to close in around her heart pounding in her ears. Had Alice heard him too? Was it just her own guilt manifesting? Or was there something more to it? Something darker? She wanted to tell Alice everything. The guilt, the nightmares, the voice on the phone. But how could she? How could she confess to the one person who still believed in her, still saw her as the grieving widow? Instead, Sarah stayed silent, swallowing the truth like poison. She could never tell Alice. She could never tell anyone. This was her burden to carry, and it was slowly killing her. The days after her visit with Alice passed in a haze. Sarah tried to shake the feeling that something or someone was constantly watching her, but it clung to her like a second skin. The phone calls continued, sometimes at odd hours of the night, other times during the day. The voice never said more than a few words, but each time it was unmistakable. It was Tom's voice, calm yet sinister, haunting her even in death. "You can't run," it whispered one night. The following evening, "You'll pay for what you did." Sarah was unraveling faster than she could control. The guilt was swallowing her whole, and the paranoia of being caught clawed at her every moment. Her hands shook when she made coffee, her heart raced when she answered the phone at work, and she could barely focus during conversations with her coworkers. Clara had noticed the change, but Sarah had long since abandoned trying to act normal. It was too late for that. She started skipping work, spending hours locked in her apartment, pacing the floors, checking the windows for any sign of the figure she had seen weeks before. Each creak of the floorboards, each flicker of a shadow outside sent her into a spiral of panic. She was convinced someone knew. Someone was watching her, waiting for her to slip up. One afternoon, after another sleepless night, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, staring at the old landline phone she had bought a few months earlier. She had used it to replace the cell phone she'd thrown out after the calls began. Maybe it had been paranoid, but she couldn't stand hearing Tom's voice on that phone anymore. She was hoping the calls would stop once she changed her number, but they didn't. The new phone rang again, just as it had so many nights before. It was almost as if the phone itself had become a symbol of her guilt, taunting her. She hesitated, staring at it as the ringing echoed in the small kitchen. Her fingers hovered over the receiver. She was too terrified to answer, yet unable to ignore it. She picked it up, slowly bringing it to her ear, bracing herself. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The line crackled for a moment before the familiar, cold voice slid through the phone. "You can't hide from me, Sarah." Her blood ran cold. She gripped the phone tightly, her mind spinning. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Tom was dead. This had to be someone else, some cruel, sick joke. But the voice, the way it twisted her name, was unmistakable. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The line went dead. Sarah dropped the phone, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She stood frozen in the kitchen, her mind racing, heart pounding. Whoever this was, they knew. They knew what she had done. But how? She had been so careful. She had covered her tracks, made sure no one could trace Tom's death back to her. She needed to calm down, think rationally. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe someone was trying to mess with her, knowing that Tom's death had left her vulnerable. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just paranoia. Someone was out there, watching her every move. In the days that followed, Sarah became more and more reclusive. She stopped going to work altogether, avoiding people as much as possible. Clara called a few times, asking if she was all right, offering to help, but Sarah never answered. She couldn't. No one could help her. She was trapped in her own mind, spiraling deeper into her paranoia with each passing day. The calls came more frequently now, the voice on the other end growing more taunting, more accusatory. "You thought you could get away with it, didn't you?" it would say, or, "It's not over yet, Sarah." She started hearing the voice even when the phone wasn't ringing, catching it in whispers when she was alone in her apartment. Sometimes she would hear footsteps in the hallway outside her door, a faint knock that sent her heart racing. She would rush to the door, flinging it open, only to find no one there. But she knew someone had been there. She could feel it. Her nights became unbearable. Every time she closed her eyes, Tom's face appeared in her dreams, twisted in anger, his hands reaching out for her, accusing her of his death. "You'll pay for what you did," he would say, over and over, his voice echoing in her mind long after she woke up, drenched in sweat. Sleep offered no respite, only more torment. The guilt was suffocating, and Sarah felt like she was losing her grip on reality. She knew she needed to do something, to take control before everything fell apart. But what? The police were no option. What could she tell them? That she was being haunted by her dead husband's voice? They would think she was insane. And maybe she was. One night, after another fitful dream, Sarah decided she couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. She needed to get out, to clear her head, to put distance between herself and whatever was happening. She grabbed her coat and hurried out the door, the cold night air biting at her skin as she walked aimlessly through the streets. The city was quiet, the streets nearly deserted at this late hour. Sarah pulled her coat tighter around her, her breath visible in the chilly air as she walked. But the further she went, the more she felt that same unsettling sensation, that someone was watching her. She glanced over her shoulder, but the street was empty. Still, the feeling persisted. She quickened her pace, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The familiar fear gripped her chest, and she forced herself to keep walking, to ignore the prickling sensation at the back of her neck. But as she passed an alleyway, something caught her eye. A figure. For a moment, her heart stopped. It was the same figure she had seen weeks ago, the one standing outside her apartment that night. It was them. They were watching her. Sarah's feet froze, her body paralyzed with fear. The figure remained still, standing just at the edge of the shadows, watching her. She couldn't make out their face, but the mere presence of them sent a wave of terror through her. Without thinking, she turned and ran. Her feet pounded against the pavement as she sprinted down the street, her heart racing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't stop running until she reached the front door of her apartment building, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the keys. She glanced over her shoulder, expecting to see the figure following her, but there was no one. She slammed the door behind her, locking it and pressing her back against it, gasping for breath. Her entire body shook with fear, her mind spinning. She wasn't imagining it. Someone was out there. Someone new. The calls, the figure, the nightmares, they were all pieces of a puzzle that Sarah couldn't solve. But one thing was becoming increasingly clear. She was no longer in control. The more she tried to escape her past, the more it seemed to haunt her, like a predator slowly closing in on its prey. She couldn't keep running forever. Eventually, the truth would catch up to her. Sarah's heart pounded as she locked herself inside her apartment, every nerve on edge. The shadowy figure she had seen outside confirmed her worst fears. Someone new, someone was watching her. But what terrified her the most wasn't just being discovered. It was the unraveling sense that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't losing her mind. The phone calls, the whispers, the presence of that figure. It was all too real. She couldn't live like this anymore, trapped in her own mind and hunted by the remnants of her past. The apartment, which had once been her refuge, now felt like a prison. Every wall seemed to close in on her. Every creak and groan of the building sent her heart racing. She knew she had to leave, but where could she go? Wherever she went, her guilt would follow. Days passed, each one blending into the next, filled with paranoia and a growing sense of dread. The phone calls continued, but Sarah no longer answered. She couldn't. The sound of Tom's voice, whether real or imagined, sent chills down her spine. She disconnected the landline, but even in silence, his presence seemed to haunt her every waking moment. And then came the final straw. It was a Sunday afternoon when Sarah heard the knock on the door. Her heart skipped a beat, her mind immediately jumping to the worst possible conclusion. She had been avoiding everyone, her neighbors, her co-workers, even Alice, so no one should have been there. Slowly, she approached the door, peeking through the peephole. The figure stood there, just as before, cloaked in shadows. A surge of panic hit her, and she stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. Whoever it was, they had found her again. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. Sarah's mind raced. She had to get out. She couldn't stay here any longer, not with the constant threat hanging over her head. It didn't matter if it was Tom's ghost or someone who had figured out what she had done. She had to disappear. The next morning, Sarah made the decision to sell the apartment. She couldn't risk staying in the city any longer. The figure, the phone calls, the guilt, they were all suffocating her. She needed a fresh start, somewhere far from the memories of Tom, far from the shadow that lingered over her life. She contacted the realtor that same day, explaining in a rushed, anxious voice that she needed to sell quickly. Her reasoning sounded thin, even to her own ears. "I've just had a change of heart. I need a new start." But the realtor didn't question it. The housing market was hot, and Sarah's apartment was in a prime location. It sold faster than she had anticipated, the paperwork finalized in just under 2 weeks. During that time, Sarah packed her belongings methodically, moving like a ghost through the apartment she had once thought of as her safe haven. She wrapped the dishes, folded the blankets, boxed up her few possessions, but there was no sentimental attachment to any of it. Everything felt temporary, as if she were only passing through this life, waiting for it to catch up with her. As the final day in the apartment drew near, the weight of everything she had done began to press down harder than ever. She sat on the floor of the living room, staring at the now empty walls, remembering the woman she had been when she first moved in, the woman who had believed she could leave her past behind. But there was no escaping it. No matter how far she ran, the past would always follow. Tom would always follow. The phone rang again that night, the last night she would spend in the apartment. Even with the landline disconnected, the ringing echoed in her mind, relentless and haunting. She tried to block it out, but it was impossible. The voice would always find a way to reach her, reminding her of what she had done. "You can't run," the voice whispered, as it always did. Sarah pressed her hands to her ears, trying to drown out the sound. But the voice wasn't just in the phone anymore. It was inside her, crawling beneath her skin, rooting itself in the darkest corners of her mind. The following day, as she handed over the keys to the new owners, Sarah felt a brief moment of relief. She had sold the apartment. She was free, at least for now. But as she walked away from the building, her suitcase rolling behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone she passed, her heart racing with every step. The figure had appeared too many times now, always lurking in the shadows, always just out of reach. What did they want? Why wouldn't they leave her alone? When she arrived at the bus station, Sarah bought a ticket to a city she had never heard of, far enough away that no one would know her name, no one would know her story. She sat on the bench, waiting for the bus, her eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of the figure. But no one stood out, no one watched her, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only temporary. She had run before, and she would run again. But how long could she keep running before everything caught up to her? The bus arrived, and Sarah boarded, taking a seat near the back where she could see the door. She watched as the last of the passengers filed in, her eyes searching for a familiar face, but there was none. She was alone, at least for now. As the bus pulled away from the station, Sarah leaned her head against the window, her mind a whirlwind of fear, guilt, and uncertainty. She had gotten away with murder. She had convinced herself of that, but what was the price of living with the weight of it? Hours passed as the bus traveled further and further from the city. The landscape outside blurred as Sarah's mind drifted between sleep and waking, between fear and exhaustion. She wasn't sure where she was going, but it didn't matter. The further she got from her old life, the better. But deep down, she knew there was no real escape. Not from herself, not from Tom. The bus came to a stop at a rest area, and Sarah stretched her legs, stepping off for a moment of fresh air. The sky had grown dark, the wind picking up as the night settled in. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside her mind. That's when she saw it. Across the parking lot, standing beneath the dim glow of a street lamp, was the figure. The same one that had been haunting her for weeks, always just out of reach, always watching. Sarah's heart froze. She blinked, her breath catching in her throat. The figure didn't move, didn't come closer, just stood there, watching her with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. This time, Sarah didn't run. She couldn't. She stood rooted to the spot, her mind spinning with the terrifying realization that no matter how far she went, no matter how many cities she fled to, this figure would always find her. Because the figure wasn't just some stranger. It wasn't a ghost or a phantom of her guilt. It was a reflection of everything she had done, everything she had become, and no matter where she went, she couldn't outrun herself. The moment Sarah realized the figure would never leave her, everything inside her broke. Standing at the rest stop, staring across the lot at the shadowy form that had haunted her every move, she understood that there was no escape. The figure wasn't someone else. It was her guilt, her fear, her own mind tearing itself apart. She had spent so long running from the consequences of her actions, but now, as the weight of it all came crashing down, there was nowhere left to go. The figure didn't move. It stood perfectly still, bathed in the dim glow of the street lamp, as if waiting for her to make the next move. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, her body trembling, but she couldn't run anymore. She had run far enough. She took a shaky breath and stepped forward, her feet moving of their own accord, carrying her closer to the figure. The fear that had been her constant companion was still there, but something else stirred within her now, an odd sense of resignation. It was time. Time to face what she had done, time to face the truth. As she approached, the figure remained still, its face obscured by the shadows. Sarah felt a strange calm wash over her as she drew near. The closer she got, the more the fear receded, replaced by an eerie clarity. It was as though everything she had been running from was condensed into this one moment. Finally, she stood only a few feet away from the figure. Her breath came out in shallow gasps, but she forced herself to stay rooted in place. She had to know, had to see the truth. Slowly, hesitantly, Sarah reached out a hand, as if to touch the figure. Her fingers trembled in the air, inches away from the shadowy form. And then, with a slow, deliberate movement, the figure stepped forward into the light. What Sarah saw sent a shock through her entire body. It was Tom, but not the sick, weakened man she had poisoned. No, this Tom was whole again, strong, imposing, his eyes dark and filled with accusation. His face was twisted with anger, but beneath the fury was something else. Disappointment. As if he had always known what she was capable of, but had hoped she would prove him wrong. "You thought you could get away with it," he said, his voice low and cold, the same voice that had haunted her phone calls. "But you can't." Sarah stumbled back, her heart racing, her mind spinning. It wasn't possible. Tom was dead. She had watched him die. She had killed him. Her voice faltered. "I had no choice. You were going to kill me." Tom's expression didn't change. He simply stood there, his eyes locked on hers, unblinking. "You did this, Sarah. You took everything, and now you're running." Tears blurred her vision, and Sarah felt her legs go weak beneath her. "I didn't want to do it," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I had to. You would have killed me if I hadn't." Tom's eyes narrowed, his voice a harsh whisper. "You think that excuses you? You think you can just run from what you did?" The weight of his words crushed her, the guilt overwhelming. She sank to her knees, her hands covering her face as sobs racked her body. She had told herself over and over that she had no other choice, that it was him or her. But now, faced with the truth, she couldn't hide from it any longer. She had killed him. She had poisoned him slowly and deliberately, and no amount of justifying could change that. The figure, Tom, stepped closer, looming over her, his voice echoing in the still night air. "You'll never be free, Sarah. You'll carry this with you for the rest of your life. No matter where you go, no matter how far you run, you'll never escape." The truth of his words settled deep in her bones, a cold, hard fact she could no longer deny. She couldn't outrun her guilt. She couldn't outrun herself. Sarah raised her head, her tear-streaked face illuminated by the street lamp's dim glow. She looked up at Tom, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you want from me?" Tom didn't answer. He simply stood there, watching her with those dark, accusing eyes. And in that silence, Sarah realized what she had to do. The next morning, Sarah found herself in a small police station, far from the city where her life had unraveled. She sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair, her hands shaking as she filled out the forms, her mind still spinning from the events of the night before. The figure, the confrontation with Tom, it had all been in her mind, a manifestation of her guilt. But it didn't make it any less real. She had finally come face to face with the truth, and now there was only one thing left to do. The officer behind the desk looked up from his paperwork, his brow furrowed in confusion. "You're here to report? A crime?" Sarah nodded, her throat tight. "Yes, a murder." The officer's eyes widened, and he motioned for her to follow him. She stood on shaky legs and walked into the small interrogation room, the weight of her confession pressing down on her like a lead blanket. As she sat down across from the detective, she took a deep breath, the words spilling out of her mouth before she could stop them. "I killed my husband," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I poisoned him. I made it look like a heart attack, but it was me." The detective's pen froze mid-scribble, his eyes narrowing as he looked up at her. "Are you saying you're confessing to a murder?" Sarah nodded, her hands trembling. "Yes, I did it. I killed him." The room seemed to close in around her, the air thick with tension as the detective leaned back in his chair, studying her. The weight of her confession hung in the air, heavy and final. There was no going back now. Hours later, as Sarah sat in the cold, sterile cell, the reality of her situation settled in. She had confessed. She had finally stopped running. The world outside was moving on without her, but for the first time in months, she felt a strange sense of peace. There were no more phone calls, no more whispers in the night. The figure, the haunting presence of Tom, was gone. She had faced the truth, and in doing so, she had found some semblance of freedom. It wasn't the kind of freedom she had imagined. It wasn't a fresh start, far away from the past, but it was freedom nonetheless. A freedom from the weight of guilt that had been crushing her since the moment she decided to poison Tom. As Sarah lay on the hard, narrow bed, staring up at the ceiling, she felt a tear slip down her cheek. It was over. The running, the fear, the lies, it was all over. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah could finally breathe.